I had a heart attack the day after Christmas 1977. And I had been under the care of a doctor, a medical doctor, and he waited until November of '78, and then he decided that I needed an angiogram because something was wrong. So he sent me to 2 cardiologists, and 3 days later I had a double bypass on December the 4th, 1978. And I didn't feel very well after that surgery for about 2 months. It seemed like I was doing okay, and then I couldn't walk anymore. They wanted me to walk a mile or 2 at a certain pace, say a mile in 15 minutes, and I kept telling them I felt worse and worse, so they told me just take more nitroglycerin. Start out with nitroglycerin, and on the walk take nitroglycerin. But that didn't help me. So we have a Bible study in our home, and there was an RN that came in and 2 years ago, and she told me, well, Millie, what you need is chelation. Well, that was a new word to me.
Welcome to the world of chelation therapy. As most physicians know, this is a subject that is really quite controversial. However, we find that we look into the history of the thing, we find that it makes a lot of good molecular logic. And today I'd like to very briefly explain to you what we mean by chelation. The term originates from the Greek, meaning the grasping or the pinching claw of a crab, the chele. As we use this topic in the field of medicine, we're talking about the metal binding properties of certain chemical agents. In the case of chelation therapy and the use of treatment, the treatment of atherosclerosis, hardening of the arteries, we're talking specifically about the use of ethylene diamine tetracetic acid, a very fascinating synthetic amino acid, usually going under the acronym of EDTA. The history of it is interesting in that it came out literally of Hitler Germany. Back in the mid-30s from A.G. Farben, a huge conglomerate where the Germans at that time were interested in becoming totally independent of various chemical substances from the outside world. And so they were looking at some of the polyamino carboxylic acid series as a substitute for citric acid. In the due course of time, they found that this very fascinating compound had the ability to go in and bind onto a metallic ion, incorporate it into a heterocyclic ring structure, and thereby remove it out of the body. This had obvious applications clinically to the field of heavy metal intoxication, lead poisoning, mercury poisoning, various other types of heavy metal poisonings. In the due course of time, the material literally migrated to the United States. They were using it in cleaning industrially, all sorts of things, wherever they needed to remove a metallic ion, and particularly calcium. They were using it clinically in the Detroit area back in the late 40s, and decided that they would use this compound to try to remove lead. In the course of their activities, they observed that some of the patients that were suffering from lead poisoning also had problems in terms of arthritis. They had problems in terms of heart disease. Some of them had senility. Some of them were suffering from peripheral vascular disease. And they found, lo and behold, that some of these patients started to improve. the question came about is, how does this thing actually function? Which led me finally, in the due course of time, to write a book called The Scientific Basis of Chelation Therapy. This particular book is concerned primarily with the scientific rationale to determine whether or not there is really any molecular logic in the use of this particular chemical compound. We find a number of advantages here. We see evidence where there's an improvement of cardiac contractility. We see improvements in collateral circulation. We see improvements in terms of the overall circulation, a lowering or reducing, as it were, of the viscosity so that the blood flows more readily. We see an improvement, evidence of an improvement in enzyme function. So it's really a host of things that are taking place, and as time goes on, we're learning more and more about the mechanisms of action of EDTA. Lest you feel a little uncomfortable as to the question, well, how does EDTA work? What are the precise mechanisms of action? May I call your attention to the fact that despite the fact we have been using aspirin now since the mid-1800s, we still are learning more and more about the mechanisms of action of aspirin. Aspirin, incidentally, has a chelating action. I have had 41 treatments myself, and I find that most physicians that administer EDTA in the treatment of atherosclerosis also take it themselves. And this, to me, is a serious endorsement, a very significant endorsement in terms of the use of EDTA in the treatment of atherosclerotic disease. I highly recommend the thing to you, and I think that you will find, as a physician, as you continue to use this and explore this fascinating therapy, and if you really start to delve in the bioinorganic chemistry behind it, and the world of enzymology, the world of immune competence, the world of immunochemistry, you'll become truly fascinated, and you will begin to ask the serious question, why has the medical field been so slow to accept this particular form of therapy? So you won't become too discouraged. Let me say this, that it took them over 80 years to accept the sulfa drugs. It took them 14 years to accept penicillin, which has certainly saved the lives of literally millions and millions of people. The history of medicine is that it's slow to accept and to use some of these fascinating therapies.
In 1976, I think it was, I was unloading some instruments, amplifiers and the like, here in the Hollywood area, and all of a sudden my shoulders lit up like I had a giant heartburn. And I thought that's what it was, but it persisted. And it even got worse to the point where I was holding my shoulders because it was so burny and so hot. At that time, I was living down in North San Diego County and had divorced myself from medical help in the Los Angeles area, but in desperation the next day, after the burning continued all night, I finally called a general practitioner up in Northridge. Well, he put the EKG on me in the office, and as they always do, it came out normal. And I finally said, "Doc, I'm burning up in my shoulders." And he said, "Well, it's heartburn." So then it was the Maalox and the Alka-Seltzer routine, and finally, before the recording session that night, miraculously it went away. I drove back down to La Costa, and the next day, upon arising, here came the burning again. So I had met a man with a cardiology group over at the Tri-Cities Hospital down near La Costa, and he ran a check on me, and he said, "I don't think there's anything too much wrong with you, Red," but he said, "Just to be safe one of these days, I'll have you jump on the treadmill." So a couple of weeks later, onto the treadmill I got, and here came the bright lights and the burning in the shoulders and the chest area, and the diagnosis was coronary insufficiency. But the two doctors stood there and said, "You need bypass surgery. There's no question about it." But there was something about the bypass surgery that I don't know if it turned me off or frightened me or I didn't quite believe in it. but at any rate, I elected not to have it. About that time, I became acquainted with chelation.
Chelation therapy for the patient is very simple. The patient is seated in a reclining chair. The smallest little needle is placed in the vein of the hand or the arm, and this needle leads up to a tube leading up to a bottle of fluid containing minerals, vitamins, and that special amino acid EDTA, which has that great affinity for calcium. And once the patient is stabilized with his needle, he is free to move about, to read, to eat, to move to the restroom. And as he takes these treatments, which last 4 hours, 3 times a week, more and more calcium and heavy metals are taken out of the body. Now, the more calcium that leaves the body, the more flexible the artery becomes, the smoother the wall becomes, and the more oxygen-rich blood arrives at the depot, the brain, the heart, the legs, and all the organs and tissues.
That's why I always tell anyone who I talk to about chelation, if it's 2 or 3 or 4 treatments like they've heard that's so wonderful, then they start feeling better. I don't want them ever be discouraged with this treatment.
To determine and verify that a patient is a candidate for chelation therapy, we satisfy what we call criteria for chelation therapy. First of all, we must prove through objective testing that the patient has a condition that is severe enough to warrant the treatment. And secondly, we must verify that the filtering system, the lungs, the liver, and especially the kidneys can handle the job, because the excess calcium is taken out in solution through the kidneys and it leaves the body in the urine. When we're born and when we're very young, our arteries are nice and open and smooth, and as each decade goes by, things begin to happen. Something we unknowingly do every day in our lives is really killing us, because when we get to this stage, we're set up for a blood clot or a blowout. When the final accident happens, if it happens in the muscle of the heart, we call that a myocardial infarct or heart attack. If there's a ballooning of the vessel, we call that an aneurysm, and it can happen anywhere in the body. If it happens in a portion of the brain tissue, we call that a stroke. And if the accident stops the blood flow to an extremity, we usually call it gangrene. The cause is always the same: disease in the system of our arteries. We are all candidates for heart and artery disease, because the quiet process that starts when we're very young has already started in our bodies. Chelation therapy is a biological treatment which is operating at the atomic and molecular level to correct the effects of this artery disease. It works many ways that we know about, and it's doing a lot of things we don't know about. One of the things we know is that the EDTA used in the solution has a strong affinity for calcium and heavy metals and escorts them out of the body. When the FDA approved calcium-blocking drugs, that was a signal that the medical establishment recognized that calcium is a main villain in this disease. EDTA is the original calcium antagonist, and it is still the most effective calcium blocker because it removes the deposits of abnormal calcium. And along with the calcium, it takes out the heavy metals and eliminates the need for constant medication. EDTA, chelation therapy, like all therapies, should be judged on its own merits, but comparisons are inevitable. With EDTA, it is usually compared to bypass surgery. And it is important to understand that EDTA can be used in conjunction with other therapies, such as bypass surgery. It is possible to delay or even avoid bypass surgery, and many patients who have had bypass surgery come because they have a return of their symptoms or because they had a replugging of one of their bypasses. One should not think of EDTA, chelation therapy, in opposition to or in competition with another therapy, not even bypass surgery. As a matter of fact, there are cases on records where patients did not qualify for a needed bypass But after chelation therapy, their small auxiliary vessels were so much improved that they were then able to go and have the bypass and therefore have the advantage of the combined treatment. Bypass surgery to fix the small, immediate problem, and chelation therapy to open up their distal circulation so they could better survive the operation and better benefit from the operation after they had it. The reason EDTA was never approved by the FDA is that the patents on the products expired. Therefore, any pharmaceutical company that spent approximately $30 million to prove to the FDA that it was valuable for this treatment had no way of recovering their money. But the pharmaceutical companies did spend $100 million in seeking and getting approval of calcium-blocking drugs. EDTA is still the original, the granddaddy, the best calcium blocker, the best calcium antagonist. The literature is quite filled with reprints of the efficacy of EDTA chelation therapy. Over 1,000 in this volume alone, and there are other reprints. There are books that can be purchased in the usual health food stores and major bookstores, and medical libraries have reprints of the studies that have been done to date, and more will be done.
My story begins 5 years ago last September when my wife had to call paramedics and have me taken to the hospital. I did not have a pain. I simply knew that there had something happened to my heart. In the hospital, I spent 3 days in cardiac care, and they did an angiogram of my heart, and the result was that I had my 4 main arteries 90, 80, 80, and 80% occluded, plus 3 more minor occlusions. They wanted me to immediately stay in the hospital and have a triple or quadruple heart bypass. With my knowledge of heart conditions and knowing that the biggest proportion of these surgeries are not necessary, I refused. The doctor thought I was a little bit peculiar, but then I convinced him that I didn't want it. Shortly after that, I learned about chelation. And then I decided to have it done. The American Academy of Medical Preventics is very important in the chelation because they set up the protocol, and the doctors that belong to this society are highly skilled in the giving of chelation. Within a few months, I went to Dr. Julian, and in his office I received chelation treatments for a period of approximately 3 months. Perhaps it was a little longer. It was from March till June. The second treatment brought back the blood supply to my feet, which were very cold. I am a diabetic of many years, and the capillaries in the hands and feet of a diabetic become obstructed, and I was wearing wool socks to bed. When my feet turned from cold to warm, I got rid of all this, and I was really astonished. I continued my treatments with continual improvement in my heart until I got to the point where I was in the habit of walking 3 miles every day.
Looking at the future for treatments for vascular disease, the place of chelation therapy is assured. Having treated 250,000 patients with this treatment, having witnessed the record of over 3 million treatments being given, I think it's inevitable that chelation therapy will take its place, its logical place, along with other therapies, and when a patient comes for a treatment, he will not be asked, do I take chelation, do I take something else? The patient will then get the treatment or combination of treatments which are most appropriate for their condition at that stage of their condition in their time. That is the future I see for chelation therapy.
A few years ago, I was practicing traditional medicine in this beachside community in California, and I heard about the marvelous results that were being achieved in the preventive medicine field, specifically with a form of treatment called chelation therapy. Being somewhat skeptical about the matter, I decided to set up my own studies to determine if we could demonstrate by objective tests whether this form of treatment, i.e. chelation therapy, really helped patients with different types of vascular disease. The first group that we studied was patients with arteriosclerotic heart disease, and we decided to measure their ejection fraction by a nuclear medicine technique using the isotope technetium-99m. This study, which is called at our hospital the heart wall motion study, measures the ejection fraction along with other heart parameters. As you may know, the ejection fraction is a standard measure or test in modern cardiology. We measured the ejection fraction on a series of 12 patients before chelation therapy and after approximately 20 of the treatments, which were given intravenously. This comprised our heart study. It was subsequently published, and it revealed that 11 out of 12 patients in the series obtained a statistically significant rise or improvement in their ejection fraction as a consequence of chelation therapy. This print of a standard technique for measuring the ejection fraction shows the technique with the Baird camera, in which the isotope technetium-99m is used. In our study, the ejection fraction was measured before and at the end of the chelation series and showed a statistically significant rise in the ejection fraction as a result of chelation therapy. The second portion of our study dealt with a group of 15 patients who had different types of brain disease. Most of these had the usual form of stroke. However, several of them had the form of senility, which is referred to as Alzheimer's disease. These patients were studied measuring their brain flow utilizing the isotope technetium-99m before and at the end of the chelation series. If you will refer to this illustration, this indicates the type of computer curve that is obtained when the blood flow study is done. The isotope technetium is injected in the arm, and as the blood flows to the brain, this curve rises, and as it flows out of the brain, it drops to point B. There's a recirculation curve, and then the curve levels off. If you will remember, please, this normal curve, because we're going to be seeing a number of examples of normal and abnormal findings. If you will refer here, again, we see a normal curve with the blood flow to the brain, out of the brain, and level off. As the blood flow becomes slowed in a patient with brain disease, the curve deviates to the right, indicating a longer time in the flow of blood to the brain, and it takes longer to get out of the brain. Therefore, the curve deviates to the right and levels off here. With extreme degrees of abnormality, as shown in the curve to the right, it again takes longer for the blood to get to the brain, and there is a high level-off curve, which is marked extreme abnormality. Next, we're going to turn to some individual curves to see what happened in these patients before and at the end of their chelation treatments. This patient, whose initials RG, was 66, had diabetes and peripheral vascular disease, as well as her brain disorder. This shows the brain flow curve on the left side and the right side of the brain before therapy. And after 20 IVs, a much more normal brain flow curve is obtained. Another example was this lady whose initials are BM. She was 51 and had the diagnosis of schizophrenia. When her brain flow study was done, you can see that it was extremely abnormal. After 13 IVs, a much more normal brain flow curve was obtained. And interestingly enough, her schizophrenia went into remission, and she is leading an entirely normal life at this time. The third case is an even more interesting case, inasmuch as it was an even more abnormal problem. This lady was referred to our clinic in Long Beach with the diagnosis of senile dementia. Her age was 72, and she had a CT scan evidence of cerebral atrophy. The control study showed marked abnormality of her brain flow study on both sides of the brain. At this point, she did not recognize her husband of 45 years, and if she would walk out in front of her house, she could not find her way back into her residence. After a series of chelation therapy, the blood flow is much more normal. You might be interested to know that after the 6th IV, her mental functioning cleared, she recognized her husband, and was much more normal. Peripheral vascular disease has also been found to be effectively treated by chelation therapy. Some time ago, I received a frantic call from a gentleman who resides in Palm Beach, Florida. I picked up the phone in my office in Long Beach, and this gentleman, whose initials are AH, indicated that he had been a diabetic of many years and had been told that he was to have his foot amputated. He wondered if chelation therapy could possibly save his foot from amputation. I told him we could give him no guarantees, but if he wanted to come to Long Beach, we'd do what we could. The illustration that is being shown indicates an extremely abnormal foot. A deep penetrating ulcer is present between the first and second toe. The depth of the ulcer is 2 centimeters, and the breadth is 2 centimeters. X-rays revealed that the infection had spread not only throughout the forefoot, but into the bones of the forefoot. We began immediate chelation therapy as well as intravenous antibiotics, and the series of illustrations show the progressive healing which did take place. I should point out that the patient had previously been hospitalized in his hospitals in Palm Beach, Florida. He had seen the very best vascular specialists that were available there. He had had intravenous antibiotics and all the treatments that were available, except that he had not had chelation therapy. And today, he walks on both feet. His foot is completely healed, and he attributes his healing not only to the goodness of God, but to the progressive advance of medicine, which includes chelation therapy. A few years ago, I was practicing medicine, traditional medicine, like any other internist and cardiologist in the country. I kept hearing about reports of patients who had been helped or healed by a form of treatment which is called chelation therapy. I decided to set up my own studies in order to determine the effectiveness of chelation treatments. And after I administered the few treatments, all of the patients seemed to be better. If they had heart pains, their heart pains were going away. If they had had a stroke, they were walking better. And I decided this is too good to be true. It might be a placebo effect, and that I would set up my own studies. We measured brain flow using an isotope technique, and we measured heart function using another isotope technique, which gives us the measurement of the ejection fraction, a standard measurement in modern cardiology. The results were even better than I had hoped. They indicated significant improvement in blood flow to the brain, increased blood flow or performance of the heart, and general well-being of the patient. I've continued to follow and use this form of therapy, which to my estimate is the modern wave or medicine of the future, in which proper nutrition, regular exercise, an appropriate diet, minimizing fats, the utilization of vitamin and mineral supplements as indicated, as well as chelation therapy is offered to the patient. And I believe this is the medicine of the future.
And as I was coming over here this morning for this treatment, I thought, 2 years ago, I certainly couldn't have been driving over here with such joy in my heart, because I just didn't think that I would even make it, that before they started the treatments. I didn't think that my heart could stand much more pain. I've been in just almost constant pain. And it's so wonderful not to wake up at night with those horrible chest pains. And I go to bed just knowing that I'll have a good night's sleep. And I certainly do like this treatment, and I think that it is really the answer, really, truly the answer.
Chelation therapy is here to stay. It will not go away. It will be here for the foreseeable future until such time as we can learn to conduct our lifestyles and our healthcare system in such a way that we can postpone or obviate the need for even chelation therapy.